everybody. Welcome to AppScript Crash Course. My name is Kalyan Reddy, and this is my coworker, Arun Nagarajan. And today we're going to be talking about ScriptDb. We're going to be taking a deep dive into some of the features to tell you all about the different areas that you can focus in and show you some examples.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do is start off with just some introductory slides, kind of set the stage, show a little bit about what the context of ScriptDb is. Then we'll look at some of the tutorials we already have, highlight some of the important things that you should know. We'll show some of the important documentation elements, and then we'll get into the script editor and start writing some interesting examples, and then maybe even look at some other things you could do with ScriptDb. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Excellent. So yeah, let me just kind of kick off things on my presentation here. So ScriptDB was originally announced at Google I/O last year in 2012. So it's less than a year old, but it's actually getting a good amount of feature set that it has, and you can do a lot of interesting things with it. So it's a JavaScript object database. So what you're able to do is just take native JavaScript objects and dump it right into this database, which is really powerful. Every script project gets its own database. So you're able to have a scope that is wide to the entire script that you have. So multiple users can share the same database. You can actually segment out data by having multiple different properties for different users, but it's kind of scoped at the script level. The API, I think, will be extremely simple and straightforward to use, as you'll see, for create, read, update, deletes, and things like that. And the paradigm will be very similar to other NoSQL databases that you may be used to.
And can you give an example of a NoSQL database or how that differs?
Yeah, so NoSQL sort of, it's not like an official term or anything like that, but it's something that people have started to use as far as when something is non-relational. There's actually a really good Wikipedia page on it. I highly recommend it. A lot of good examples in here about what a NoSQL database is, what the different types of them are, object store, graph stores, key value stores. We're more on the document store level of things.
Okay.
But a popular one is MongoDB, CouchDB. There really is quite a few variations of these NoSQL databases. And the idea is that you're programming and you're working with objects in most programming languages. And you want to be able to just take that object and store it rather than have to convert that into a relational data set and save it. Okay? So that's the idea behind NoSQL databases.
I can see how it would be simpler to use and potentially more powerful.
Right. So it kind of takes away the normalization, denormalization of an object from a database to a programming layer and then back. So it saves you that overhead.
Gotcha.
But it is sort of a newer phenomenon. So a lot of people, when they come to a NoSQL data store, they're looking for, wait, how do I do joins? How do I do updates? Things like that. So it is a little bit of a learning curve, but I think it's a very short curve, and it's something that in a lot of different technologies are going that way, so it's a very useful thing. So one of the first things that folks have to get used to is what is an object? So in JavaScript, that's sort of a nebulous thing. It's not really known to be an object-oriented language, but there are certainly objects in JavaScript. So you're able to do a lot of interesting things here where you can have what's called the JavaScript map object. So this example here is an object. So that's employee data. It has a type property. You can see that it's got an employee ID, which is a numeric value. It's got a few strings, names, department ID is also numeric. So that is a object. So this is a map, we call, name and value. What are not objects are things like just a number, a string. Even an array itself is not a map object that you can store into ScriptDB. So that's important. So a lot of folks try to just say, okay, I have an array, I want to just store it. Can I just dump it into ScriptDB? Well, you have to kind of structure it in a way that it looks and feels like a map object. So that's important. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here, and we'll come back to that, and we'll actually run these so that you get a sense for how that looks and feels. But here's a very simple example of taking that object that we showed and being able to store that into a database. So you store it as db.save. So this is sort of the reference, scriptdb.getMyDB. So you'll see that line very frequently in all ScriptDB examples. And what that basically gets you is the reference for the current project's ScriptDB. and you can just say .save, and it saves the object, and then you can actually retrieve the ID if you care for.
So just to clarify, we're not specifically formatting or modifying the object in any way. It's just the original object that we constructed.
Precisely, yeah. So once you have an object that you like the shape of, and you're able to pass it around to different functions that you have, or do other things with it, then you stop worrying about, okay, is it an appropriate mode to store? You don't have to worry about even having a unique number of properties for every object. So I can add a new property here for a new object for manager, and not worry about existing objects. So that's a really nice thing too, is that your ScriptDB can be very heterogeneous. So you can have 5 employees without a manager, and you decide that out of policy, new employees need to have a manager property, and you can go and do that. In relational databases, you have to kind of alter your schema, and you have to say this is now has the default of null and things like that. Nothing to worry about like that in ScriptDB.
Reduce the overhead and the complexity.
Exactly. So it's just kind of makes you very agile, and you can kind of start storing things very quickly without having to worry about the sort of schema, which is very rigid in relational databases. And had a lot of experience with that, and I can say that there's a time and place for it, but for most things in AppScript, I would not really go that way. Great. So let's take a look at, so we saved it. How do you retrieve it? So the querying syntax is actually super straightforward. So again, you get the database reference, and the querying syntax is basically also an object by itself, and you query by example. So essentially you specify a subset of the properties that you want to filter by. So in this case, I'm trying to retrieve all employees with the employee ID of 1. And if this has any matches, it'll return an iterator. So iterator is a concept that basically fetches as you go along. So it optimizes the fetch times. So you don't try to load everything up front. You actually get a reference to what's called an iterator, and then you can say, while it's got more, keep giving it to me. So it kind of optimizes the underlying implementation rather than you having to wait for the whole result set to be aggregated and collected into a single collection that you can immediately start operating on. This allows you to do things like, well, if I find the object I care for, well, let me just get out of it. I don't care for the whole result set back from the disk.
Okay, so you can just break out of that loop.
Exactly. So the iterator concept is actually quite popular in Java and other programming languages that you may have seen. So here's how you get it. So I got the object, and then notice that it's immediately an object. So I don't have to say json.stringify or json.parse or anything like that. You actually get an actual object, and I can just start doing the dot notation on it to get the properties I care for. So I can say current.firstname, current.lastname, and I can go along. So it's quite powerful in that regard.
And when you were talking about the heterogeneous objects before, querying something, for example, employee ID 1, it'll get both types if you have multiple types.
That's right, yeah. So if I have an employee ID 2 objects with employee ID 1 by some reason, one of them has a manager, another one doesn't have a manager, I'll get both of them back. Okay. So it doesn't have to be a type, a particular type. So ScriptDB is not the only way you can store data in AppScript. So there's actually quite a few ways, and there was actually a great session at Google I/O last year where we talked about all the different mechanisms. Just to kind of highlight some of the important ones, JDBC. So if you have a relational database already with lots of data in it, you may want to continue using that. Or if you have a lot of data that you want to be able to access from other systems outside of AppScript, then JDBC makes sense. Spreadsheets are super lightweight. They have a UI, a tabular UI to go with, so it's great. However, for querying, there's no such syntax of being able to say, give me all rows where employee ID is 1, right? So that's not so nice about spreadsheets. You can actually store it in files. So Drive API, the docs list API allows you to store and retrieve files and content of a file pretty quickly. But again, not really structured, so you can kind of work with it. A couple of name value pair type storage systems, script properties and user properties, which is good for things like session ID, some lightweight preferences and things like that. And then you can actually decide to make calls out to external APIs to store things. Just like JDBC, you may want to use, App Engine has this concept that we're working on releasing soon, which is a limited trusted tester right now. We announced it at I/O last year as well, called Cloud Endpoints. So you can actually publish out an API, a REST API, where I can send up data and get storage on the server side there. Again, those are the different options, but I think ScriptDB is sort of the baked-in one that is the easiest to get started.
What are some advantages, let's say, versus using it on a spreadsheet?
So I think my favorite thing is that a lot of people prefer spreadsheets because it's got a UI, right? But as I'll show a little bit, that you can actually solve that. You can actually kind of decide that you want to build a little UI yourself. So people oftentimes kind of gravitate towards storing things in a spreadsheet because I can easily edit it or I can easily visualize it. But we can kind of work around that. The querying is sort of I think the biggest reason that I would prefer ScriptDB. So you can actually build very complex queries with sorts, with between operators, with multiple conditions, and get the exact record you care for as an object. Great. Rather than in a spreadsheet you have it's essentially a dumb table in some ways, and you have to kind of iterate through and find the rows you care for, which is not so great. So there are a lot of resources we have on ScriptDB. I'll just kind of quickly walk through some of the tutorials that we have. So if you go to our developer page, developers.google.com/apps-script, and then ScriptDB, one word, it's actually a really good tutorial. And when I was new to the team, this was actually extremely helpful, where I was able to get a very quick lay of the land of all things ScriptDB related. So it's actually pretty well organized as well. So how do you save data? How do you modify data? How do you do things like deleting, querying the database, comparison operators? And we'll actually kind of look at a few of these things. So really good examples that you can kind of copy and paste and get going. Let me point out a couple of pretty interesting ones. So here's an interesting one. So you can see that in this query right here, we're doing db.query address any of these objects. So you can say, give me results where the address object, which itself is a composite object, is Jackson, Mississippi, or New York, New York.
Okay, so basically we saw an example of a query where we gave it multiple different objects. It's like, give me something with employee ID1 and match it with something else that has this other thing.
Exactly. So, and it can actually go further where it's not just inclusive, it can say exclusive as well, and not in type scenarios. So really a lot of the semantics of what you can do with SQL, with where in, where not in, things like that, you're able to do pretty quickly with the ScriptDB syntax as well. So you can say not Texas in this case, right? And we have a pretty robust set of comparison operators as well. So it's not just literal matches. You could say numeric comparison. So you can say greater than 21, between 13 and 20. So quite a pretty robust set of things there. Sorting and paging. So pagination is something that you end up with, you have to deal with when you have just hundreds of rows, thousands of rows. A lot of cases you have, you may reach the limit, which is 50,000, right? So you have to kind of worry about making sure that you get the right set back in the beginning. So sorting becomes very important. Show the most relevant data first. But then if the user cares for more, you can hit the next button and have that call back to the server and then fetch the next 100 items.
And even if your initial query returns a lot of results, you might not want them all at the same time. We give you a certain number, and if you want more, you can paginate that query.
That's right. That's right, yeah. And another thing that I like about this tutorial is that it kind of talks about how do you apply ScriptDB. So a lot of folks, like I mentioned, are coming from a relational database world. So this actually kind of talks about, well, how do tables translate in ScriptDB, right? How do you deal with things like transactions? This is something that we have talked about a little bit, which is that in a multi-user scenario, if you're using ScriptDB, by itself, it's not guaranteed to be transactional. By itself, it's not guaranteed to be atomic. You have to kind of bake some things in to say, okay, for this particular time period, you get the lock. We have a very robust service called lock service. You're able to get the lock, write the object you want to, and then release the lock, and then the next item comes in. Mm-hmm. Same applies for deletes and updates as well. So it's actually quite powerful way to do the transactions in the way you care for, with the timeout settings you care for, rather than just sort of inherent built-in versions, which may not be appropriate for all scenarios.
So it's a great way to take two simple services we offer, combine them.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, the lock service actually, I think, underneath the covers is quite a technological, I think, a thing that we offer that really makes these sort of distributed apps very easy to build. One thing to note is dates. So we don't store dates natively. You have to tell us what time zone it's in. You have to tell us how you want to store it. The simplest would be just to get time, which will get the millisecond since epoch, which may not be appropriate for you to retrieve back. But since JSON doesn't support dates natively, we have to kind of force you to tell us, okay, what time zone, what properties about it do you want to store? You can store it as a numeric value or as a string value as well. So that's something that trips up some people that I think is important to understand. What else is relevant here that I think is quite interesting? We have a few recipes here about how do you copy a ScriptDB data from a spreadsheet to a ScriptDB and then vice versa. So I think that's pretty useful. So if you start off with a bunch of starter data in a spreadsheet, you can end up in a ScriptDB very quickly. And a couple of things here. So here's the other section that I think is relevant, and then we'll jump off from this tutorial. How do you compare it with other systems? So inserts, updates, deletes, queries. These are things that you're used to, and these are the sort of relevant SQL in MySQL or Oracle or some other system that you may be used to. And there are sort of comparisons to how it relates to our world. So this, again, I think is pretty useful. All right. Great. So there's some quota items as well towards the bottom. So definitely look at that to understand what some of the heuristics are for your particular account type. So certainly think through that. But I see that for the most case, since we're just storing text, it's extremely efficient, fast, lightweight, that I'm not really worried about quota for most things that I'm working on. And the documentation itself is actually fairly robust as well, and I'll put a plug for that as well. So hopefully that kind of gave you a couple of things that I think are relevant to understand and keep track of.
Yeah, great. So you mentioned earlier that you could use one ScriptDB in a multi-user situation, and you said it's tied to a project. So can you clarify that a little bit? Is that tied in with libraries in any way?
Yeah. So let's say that you may have a particular app that one interface is a web app, another interface might be a spreadsheet or a trigger somewhere. Right? But you may want the users to operate on the same data or make that available across the board. So the way you would do that is a library. The library has an instance of a database. Every project has its own instance of a database. We allow for you to pass in the database to the caller, or have the caller pass in its database into the library.
Okay.
So that's how you can actually share the data between multiple projects, is using libraries. So you can actually kind of share data in a very robust way. Either have one copy that is the master copy, or have the children send up its copy to a parent and things like that.
Very cool.
Yeah, so it's some good recipes around that in our tutorials as well. So what I'll do now is actually do a couple of examples of how this looks and feels. So I'm just going to copy the examples that I started with. I'm going to copy this guy. In my other window, I'm going to go to our trusted script editor. It's going to start with a blank project. Okay, so I'm just going to paste that in. Save it as ScriptDB demo. And there it is. So it's a very simple function. Just going to create an object and store it. So I'm going to run it. So ScriptDB, since it is metered, we have to have you authorize it. Very quick process, similar to other things that we have. You go through that. And that's it. So it ran. We're not doing any UI here, so I have to go view and logs, and you can see that the ID is logged here. And one thing about ScriptDB is that by itself, it has no sort of ID or unique key that it provides other than this sort of getID special function. So if I run this again, it's kind of hard to see here, but you really have a different ID that comes back, which means that there are two copies of this employee.
Okay, so this ID is for one specific object that you stored.
One instance. So since this instance is reinitialized, so employee data got reinitialized, that's a whole new object as far as ScriptDB is concerned. So if I pass this around, it'll be the same instance, but it's an entirely different instance.
Okay.
Oop, apologize for that. Reminder came back up. Okay, great. So let's kind of jump in here to another function, which is the reading of data. So this, let's go in here. Create a new method called loadEmployee. And I'll do something interesting just to kind of let you know that this is a pattern that you'll see a lot. So I'll just copy the relevant function, or the variable rather. So I'll just have one variable called db that I'll use in both functions, rather than me having to recall that. Same effect, but I think it helps you go through it. So I'm going to now query it. How many results do you expect here, Kalyan?
I expect 2.
Good. You're paying attention. I'm going to run it. And what it's doing is very straightforward. It's just going to query an employee ID. Then it's going to loop through it using the iterator that I talked about, has next. Essentially, that's a Boolean. So essentially like doing while true type thing. And I can just go take a look at the execution. Oh, not that. Take a look at the logs. And I see 2 John Tessingtons. Good sample name, I think. And so that's actually pretty useful, right? So you're able to very quickly see how do you store an object and how do you retrieve it. But so this could get a little clumsy.
Yeah, it seems like having to use the logs as an interface, it's not really clear what it actually looks like within the ScriptDB. Is there a way to clarify that?
Yeah, so today we don't really have a great sort of built-in console for ScriptDB. However, we provide, like I said before, a very robust set of APIs where if you're interested and if you're willing, you can actually build your own console for your instance. And to kind of aid that, I've actually started a very simple project, and I'll actually go to my GitHub project, my repo, and you can see that I've started this little thing called ScriptDB Visualizer. And the whole idea is that you can copy and paste this very quickly and get started for your own instance that you may have. So what I'm going to do is just copy the code here. Go to raw, copy this guy, go back here. Just going to paste this guy here. And let me just make sure that there's no conflicts. The only thing is I realized that I have 2 getDB, so I'm just going to ignore that. You can see that it's going to publish it as a web app, and there's a HTML service that HTML file that I need to pull down as well. So I'll go back here.
So you built this using our HTML service?
Yes. So it's actually a really good example for our HTML service as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So I'll go to new HTML file. I think I called it ScriptDB console, and then I'll just paste that in. Let's see, I think I mistyped this guy here. Moving too fast. All right, cool. So ScriptDB console.html. I'll dive into what's in here. This was all put together a couple hours, so certainly a lot of room for improvement. Would love for the community to get involved and build something pretty reusable and great out of this. So now what I'll do, so here's a couple of functions that we're playing with, right, Kalyan? So we're going to now basically build a little visualizer for what's in the database.
Okay.
So I can go in, and it's actually, I found out that's a great way to kind of practice your ScriptDB skills.
Right, at first it's not readily apparent, what's in there.
Right. So I can then publish it as a web app. And for now, I'll just publish it for myself. If you're publishing it out for the world, just make sure that your ScriptDB is restricted to yourself through checking the current user's email address and comparing it to a known list. That way, you're not exposing data for everybody. I believe, let me just run this guy once. I have a logger example there. So I'm going to refresh this guy. So this is it. Really Spartan, but a really simple way to kind of type in a query and then see what's in there. So here's the query that says, hopefully you can see that, just to open curly brace and end curly brace to say, give me everything. So I can just say get count.
So that's because you're not specifying anything.
That's right.
Just means
yeah, it means
everything.
star in database, in relational databases. So current count is 2. I can then say run the query. So I want to actually see the objects. It'll show me sort of a nicely formatted version of the objects that I care for.
Oh, so these are the 2 that we just added.
Exactly, and you can see that the IDs are different. And I can actually create some new objects too. So I kind of cheated and created a couple ahead of time. So I'll just go ahead and type in a new object here, save this guy. Okay, so I don't have to go to the script editor. And today you're required to kind of save one by one, but obviously you can make this, save this guy, and then also save the last guy here. And then, so I have now a few employees in my system. And now if I do get count, what do you expect, Kalyan?
Let's see, what do we have? 2 plus 4?
So first of all, I ran count for this object. I don't want that.
Oh, your query was that specific object.
Yeah, so let me run the count here, and it's 5, right? And then I can run the query, and I can see the 5 employees in it. John Tessington, Arun, Kalyan, Eric, and then the other John Tessington.
Gotcha. The 2 original ones and the 3 you just added.
Yeah. And it's actually pretty cool that I can then also go ahead and query. So I can say, show me everybody that has a department. I have to put quotes in there. ID of, I think 14 is what I had used for most of them, except for, I think I used 14 across the board. Cool. So let me just find some other example. Maybe employee ID is 1, just to kind of filter things out. Run this query, and I should get 2 items back. So you can see the sort of the double headers, double lines, kind of separate out a query run. So it's kind of useful to be able to do that.
Now, what if we wanted to pull up my record specifically?
Right. So let's filter you by your last name. And run query. And there you are.
Very cool.
And let's actually go ahead and do a couple of things here. So one of the things that we allow you to do is load by ID in here. So if you just paste in an ID, you can just run that and then get your object back as well. So you don't have to know a particular property about you. You can just kind of filter by IDs as well.
I see.
Which is, I think, quite powerful. And you can pass in multiple IDs. So I can just comma delimit here and say load by ID, and I'll get 2 objects back here.
So if you're writing a script, you could keep track of the things you've saved by their IDs.
Right. So you don't necessarily need to know some queryable attribute about an object other than its ID.
Great.
So it's actually kind of powerful. What you could also do is start deleting certain things. So I can say, show me everybody with the first name of John. So one thing you'll realize is that the count, query, and delete syntax are pretty similar. So you're essentially passing in so if I just say get count, that should return 2, right? So 2 people in there with the first name of John. I can just see who they are, these 2 people. Same exact object, but different IDs, like we know, we inserted them twice. And I can just hit delete. And now if I say run query, no one there for that. So it's actually kind of cool that the same kind of query, the query by example syntax here, works for getting the count for that, getting responses, the actual objects, and then also deleting.
Very cool.
So you can query by example. You can load and delete by IDs as well. In order to get count, you do have to pass in an actual syntax.
I see.
Okay. And I can, like I said, the actual syntax to search by itself is an object. So I could just hit save, and that object will get saved. And if I now get objects for everybody, and this will kind of show the heterogeneous aspect of it. I think I saved the empty object. So you can see that there's me, you, just John that we saved, and then also an empty object, which was my mistake, but it's there. And I can just go ahead and delete that as well. So I can just say delete that guy. And now if I run the query for everybody, so it's a pretty lightweight console, right? It's not meant to be super fancy.
But really helps you visualize these things, though.
Right. Let's just see what's in there. And you can see that it's really fast. A lot of the time is actually spent in the back and forth rather than retrieving something from the database. And we started out with the real simple example here from the samples slides that I had. We dropped in the code from my GitHub account, and then off you go.
Great.
Yeah, and just to kind of give you a sense for what the code is like, it's all HTML service. It does some interesting things with highlighting some JSON using some of the things that I found on a sample site. And it just uses the google.script.run syntax quite heavily and uses jQuery to kind of have the click handlers work on those. And that's really it. It kind of adds like a console, prepends content into your DOM. And here are the buttons and the rows in there.
So you should be able to, as it is, do most things with it, right? Like we didn't see an example specifically of updating a previous record, but you should be able to get the ID and then update it.
You should be able to update it like that. It would be great to be able to upload or insert multiple objects at once.
Yeah.
It would be cool to be able to store certain queries so you can replay it.
Yeah.
A lot of useful things can be built out of this, and hopefully that'll give you a sense for. And it's a playground to practice. And hopefully this a good thing that you can start building some useful tools with.
It's a good springboard that hopefully some of our users will take and run with. See what happens.
Excellent. Yeah, so that's really all I had. Hopefully this all made sense and was useful.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was great.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching.